Hi, I'm Mike from Craft Supplies USA, and today I'd like to introduce the Red Dragon Carbide cutters. Carbide tools have been on the market for a long time, and they're a great way for getting people into the hobby of woodturning. They're really easy because you don't have to worry about complicated bevel angles, having a sharpening system, and they're just a lot easier to use. The great thing about carbide is the edge lasts a lot longer than traditional high-speed steel. Red Dragon cutters fit the most popular carbide tools on the market, and they fit nice and tight just like the OEM cutters. They're a budget-minded option that doesn't sacrifice quality for price, and I've tested every single one of these cutters and I couldn't tell the difference between these and an OEM cutter. Red Dragon carbide cutters are a premium, high-quality carbide with a titanium nitrided finish. And that titanium nitride isn't just to make it look pretty, it also increases the wear life of your cutters. When you order a Red Dragon cutter, it's going to come in this small little envelope, and it's going to come with a cutter and a new screw. We always recommend replacing the screw every time you change the cutter because of these little heads right here tend to strip out. So we always recommend replacing the screw. But let's put one of these on a tool and show you how good the fit is. Alright, let's show you how to install a cutter. So I'll be using the smaller radius square for this pen turner, and we'll just set the cutter on there and then start threading the screw in. Usually what I like to do is get my air compressor and blow out the threads on the tool itself just to remove any debris or anything that's in those screw threads. That way it doesn't get stuck on there, and I strip out the head because the head of this is pretty small. As far as getting this tight, just finger tight is all you need. It doesn't really loosen up over time, and it's easy to over tighten these and get them stuck on the tool. But once it's on there, we can look at the fit and you can see just how well that fits, just like the OEM cutter. The great thing about carbide tools is you can turn the same types of projects as you can with traditional tools, but there's a smaller learning curve and you don't have to have as many tools. Let's go into each different type of cutter and show you what cuts they're used for. We'll start out with the square cutters here. We have the full size and the mid and smaller size here. The full square has 90-degree corners. The 4-inch radius has a slight radius to the cutting edge, and then the 2-inch radius is a little more exaggerated, and those corners are pulled back a little bit further, which is nice because you're not going to dig the corners in. The square cutters are used primarily for the roughing process. They're great for the inside of bowls, roughing square stocked around, and they're great for just getting the bulk of the material out of the way. Let's go to the lathe and show you some cuts. Alright, so with the square cutters, there's 3 different options. There's a full square, a 4-inch radius square, and a 2-inch radius square. I find them to pretty much all have the same use except for on pens. I like the 4-inch radius myself. But once we have our bowl remounted in our chuck using the tenon we cut with the diamond cutter, we've got a really good fit with our chuck jaws, and now we can use the square cutters for removing bulk material and roughing our bolt around or hollowing it out. And once it's hollowed out, we'll switch to the round cutter. Those will give us really good finishing cuts and allow us to get us a nice smooth curve on the inside of our bowl. These square cutters make it really easy to remove a lot of material at a time. So we'll use this to get rid of all that bulk in the center. And I've got this about 30 degrees off of parallel to my lathe bed. That way I'm kind of using the corner and a little bit of the left wing to rough this out. But the nice thing is with these being a carbide cutter with the titanium nitride finish, we're cutting into mulberry here. This is a pretty dense wood and it cuts like butter. So we'll keep hollowing this out. Stop and check my depth real quick. Let's say we have another inch of material to remove. So you can see we've roughed out the majority of this bowl here really quick with these square cutters. It's just so easy because we're cutting into side grain. It takes a ton of material out at a time. So the primary purpose of the square cutters and the slightly radius squares is just removing bulk material. Now we'll switch to a little piece of spindle stock and we'll show you roughing down with some square stock. Alright, with the full square cutter, I don't use this one very often because usually when I'm trying to make a cut, the corners tend to dig in. That's why I like the slightly radius cutters, because they're pulled back a little bit and I don't engage those as often during a cut. But there are a few uses with the square cutter that I really like it on, and in particular that's a planing cut. Like on the bottom of this pepper mill, I want this to be a nice perfectly flat surface, or on the undercut of a platter or something where I want that to just be nice and flat across. Having a nice flat reference face on the edge of the cutter helps me get that cut. So I can start that cut, and as long as I keep that tool in the same direction the entire way across the cut, I should have a nice and flat surface. You can see here that this surface here is nice and flat now. That's ready to sand, but I don't use this one too often, but there are times when I do need something nice and flat, and if I need a really good fillet or a square edge corner, that's where this cutter really comes into play. When you're roughing bowls or just roughing spindle stock down to round, the full square will function basically the same as the radius cutters will. And in that case, that's when I would probably switch depending on the curvature of the piece, but this one functions the same as the ones with a slight radius. Alright, so now that we've shown you how to use the square cutters on a bowl, let's show you how to use it on a spindle. This is primarily used for getting square blanks to round, getting a rough profile for your pepper mill or anything you're looking for, or especially on pens, the slightly radius square cutters are really good because we can get a nice smooth flowing curve to our pen blanks. So with these, usually I'll have the handle just a little bit above level, and we'll just go straight in. Once you have the bulk out of the way and you're just trying to get a profile, I like the slightly radius square cutters. And then I can swing that handle to start getting a curve. And the nice thing is, because we have cutting edges on the front and both sides, I can cut into that end grain as I get down in here and continue that curve. That's the really nice thing about these square cutters. And then I can switch sides and go from the other side. We'll remove some of that bulk. But the nice thing about the slightly radius, it allows you to just float that across the surface and you can get a nice smooth flowing curve. Especially on the smaller tools, you can use the smaller ones specifically for kind of pen turning stuff. But the square ones are really good for just getting the bulk out of the way. For turning pens and mandrel-based projects, I pretty much only use the smaller radius square cutter. This will excel at roughing it to round, getting that nice, slightly convex profile we're looking for on a pen, and then leaving behind a very clean surface. So here's a piece of acrylic. We'll show you roughing it, and then we'll show you the surface that'll be left behind from a carbide tool. When we're turning this, we like to keep that handle nice and parallel to the floor, and right now we're at about 2200 RPM or so. And we'll just take small bites. With this being a carbide tool and acrylic being fairly brittle, we want to take small cuts because with the carbide cutters can be pretty aggressive and tend to chip it out. So you want to be nice and light. The nice thing is we can cut on that lead edge, the left side and the front. And because we have that cutting edge on the left and the front side, we can cut all the way across that surface. The nice thing with the slightly radius is when I'm doing these long traversing cuts, I'm not getting the corners digging in too much. Those corners are pulled back slightly and they're out of the way. But I'll just do a nice light pass and show you the surface we get left off the tool. So we've got a really clean surface here that wouldn't take much sanding to level that and then start getting up our polish, but it leaves behind a really clean surface. Super easy to do, and the nice thing is I can turn so many pens with a single cutter because that carbide, especially with the titanium nitride finish on there, makes that last such a long time. You can turn a ton of pens. But you can see it's super easy to go on those nice straight curves with the square cutter or the full square. You can do a really good cut on there. So the nice thing about the carbide tools is there's certain materials where they really shine. Acrylics, really dense exotic hardwoods, they dull traditional tools so quickly, you spend so much time at the grinder. Where I can get a carbide tool and make those same cuts and not have to sharpen anything, I can be at the lathe longer, and it's not going to wear down those more expensive tools when you're trying to hollow out, say, a blackwood box or some of those, desert ironwood if you're doing a handle. Those just beat traditional tools up really bad. So it's nice to have a set of carbide tools just to remove material on those dense exotic hardwoods, and then they also leave a really clean surface. Now let's talk about the round cutters. We have the full-size round, the smaller round for the mid-size and micro tools, and then we have the really small circle, that's for the hollowing tools. These are used primarily for finishing cuts, rounding out and getting a really good curve on the inside of your bowl, and just focusing more on the shape and not removing a lot of bulk material. Let's head over to the lathe and show you what you can do with the round cutters. The round cutter is really good at smoothing out all these little ridges left behind from the square cutter when we were using that to remove the bulk of the material. Now we can come in here and just smooth this all out and get a really good curve on the inside. Once we get that smoothed out, I'll show you a little trick we can do to try and get this to where we get a really clean surface off the tool. So let's go ahead and smooth all this out. You can see it's cutting through those little steps really well. We're starting to get a nice curve on the inside of our bowl. We're going to get that undercut on our rim we're looking for. But you can see just how much better the inside of that bowl is already. We'll do a few more cuts to refine our curve. And the round cutter is less grabby because we're only engaging a small portion of the cutting surface at any given time. So it's definitely not as grabby on the inside of the bowl, especially once we're over our rest an inch or two. And it's a lot more controllable, allowing you to get a smoother curve. Alright, let's take a look at the surface we've got. Okay, I'm pretty happy with that. I've got just a little bit of a nub in the center, but that's cutting really clean. All these end grain fibers here normally tear out, and let me show you some tricks you can do to refine that without getting tear out. So normally with carbide tools, you want these tools to be nice and flat on the rest, parallel to the floor, but when we're looking for a shearing cut, we want to rotate that on a 45. So as that contacts the surface, it cuts it just a little bit cleaner. Alright, let's stop the lathe and see what kind of surface we've left behind. If we move our rest out of the way, we can look in there and see that there's really no torn fibers. That's a really clean surface. We've got a pretty decent curve in there. I might refine it just a little bit more because it's a little bit heavy down in the bottom, But that's the nice thing with these round cutters, is we can get a really clean surface and focus more on the shape, and it's not as grabby as the square cutters. Once you have that out of the way, you can switch to the round cutters. And we can do the same thing like we did on the bowl. We can rotate that on a 45 and get a shear scrape. And then we can switch it to this side of the body and then come up to center. That should leave us a pretty clean surface. Yep, it's getting rid of the tear out we had from roughing it out. And the nice thing about the round cutters, I'm going to switch to a different blank. Alright, so I've got a different blank on here. This is a pepper mill blank. It's got some complex curves and shape to it. And so I'll be using 3 of the tools to show you some different cuts we can do to get the shape in this piece. We'll start out with the round cutter. This is going to be really good for getting this nice OG curve of the shape of the pepper mill on the outside. And getting that flared opening. And once I run out of room, we'll switch to the diamond. And on these spindle blanks, again, we can shear scrape that surface to leave a little bit better final surface ready for sanding. Alright, now let's talk about the diamond cutters. There's 2 different types of diamond. One of them has more of a radius point on the tip, and the larger, longer one here has a lot more of a fine point. These are really good for shear scraping on the outside of bowls and getting small details and cutting really fine details on a piece. I prefer the RD7. It's really good for cutting tenons on bowls, cutting details on spindles, and that finer point allows you to get in there and get really precise. So let's head over to the lathe and show you what you can do with the diamond pointed cutters. Alright, so with the diamond point cutters, we've got a couple of them available. We have the RD4 and the RD7. The biggest difference being the RD7 only fits on the medium and smaller tools, and it's got a lot finer point. This one is the RD4, and this one's got a little bit bigger radius on the nose, so it can't get into the fine detail, but let's show you some cuts we can do with these tools. They're mostly for spindle type projects and creating small detail lines, but for bowls, they're really good for creating our tenon, because it allows us to get in there and cut this nice and get the angle we need to fit our chuck jaws. With that really fine point, we can get down in there and give us a really good profile for our jaws, and we can get the detail that we need. So now we have a really fine profile for our tenon, and this shoulder here is slightly undercut. So having that really fine point allows us to get in there and get that detail we need. Another benefit to these diamond pointed tools is they're really good for shear scraping the exterior of a bowl or a platter. I can drop that handle down really low, and then I can shear scrape with this tool kind of on a 45 on my tool rest. And with that being on a 45, I can shear scrape the exterior of the bowl. That's going to give us a cleaner surface. I'll go about halfway up the bowl, then I'll switch sides and come from this direction, come from the rim down to the base. I keep that handle nice and low with the tool on a 45, and then I just drag that across the surface. That's going to leave us a lot cleaner surface than the round or the square cutters will give us. So those are just a couple of the uses we can use these diamond pointed tools for. Now let's switch to a spindle piece, and we can show you some cuts with that as well. And for cutting this shoulder here, I'll go to the diamond point. This is going to be really good because I've got a long straight surface edge here. But once I need to get down into the detail lines here and cutting our little shoulder, we can use that fine detail point. That's going to cut that nice and clean. And then we'll use this diamond point to get down in here in the bottom of these radius. And I can also use that diamond to help me get the bead I'm looking for, refine that bead shape. Come back from this side just to clean it up. But we refined our bead, we cut our shoulder here really clean. Our 45-degree chamfer's cut really clean, and then we use that rougher to shear scrape and clean up the exterior of our curves right here. So what we just did is we used the 3 different shapes of cutters, the diamond point, the square, and the round. We used that square to rough this down to round. We got our round cutter in there to get our nice smooth flowing curves. Then we use that diamond point to get in here and help us get a clean cut shoulder, and then refine the curve of our bead here and have a really sharp detail line down in the bottom, and then get our 45-degree chamfer cut. So the 3 different shapes of cutters, you can do a bunch of different cuts and have really complex shapes too. That's the other thing, is a lot of people think they're limited with just having 3 sizes of cutters or 3 shapes, but you can do some really, really fine, tight detail work with them as well. So, all right, we've shown you how to use the different shaped cutters for different projects and how to get a better finish off the tool. I've been really impressed with these Red Dragon cutters, so give them a shot and let us know what you think. As always, give the video a thumbs up and subscribe to our channel for more wood turning videos.